The Isle of Pelisse, Part 5. The Battle of Highdale. Following the Battle of the Needham Road, the Earl of Westwood's dreams of conquering the land of Hildemead were in tatters. His army had been annihilated, with only the Westwood Horse Guards remaining to him. He fled westwards to Three-Legged Cross, and then north along the coast road, heading for his family seat at East Harbour. Queen Ophelia pursued him cautiously. The fugitive Earl was no longer a significant danger to her. Sooner or later she would catch up with him, and he would be captured. But although a cornered rat is not a mortal threat, it still has teeth. Ophelia had no intention of being bitten. She was happy to take her time and ensure that when she eventually closed on her prey, she brought overwhelming force to what she fully intended would be their final encounter. Meanwhile, Ophelia's husband, King Ludwig, lord of the lands between the lakes, had assembled his army and marched it to Southbridge to counter the forces of Florian the Fair, the Grand Duke of the Far Lands, which were massing on the far bank of the South Stream. Florian's intention had been to march over the river and into Southbridge. However, several elements of his army were still to join him, and, concerned that King Ludwig might launch a preemptive attack over the river, Florian fell back toward Farvale, seeking to gather his full strength before any battle was fought. Keen to force an engagement as soon as possible, King Ludwig marched his army over the river in pursuit. The Earl of Westwood did not tarry at East Harbour. Queen Ophelia and her troops were hot on his heels, and he was in no position to either fight them on the battlefield or endure a siege. As the army of Needham approached, the Earl, still accompanied by the Westwood Horse Guards, fled from East Harbour along the Woodlands Road. Queen Ophelia had anticipated some such move on the part of the Earl. She had previously detached Major Jocelyn and the 1st Hildemead Hussars from her force, with orders to recapture Woodlands and then patrol the road between Woodlands and East Harbour, in case the Earl should head that way. Major Jocelyn's orders were that he should attempt to capture the Earl if he was travelling alone, but he should not risk an encounter with the Earl's heavy cavalry. Thus, if the Westwood Horse Guards were present, the Major should content himself with locating the Earl, observing and tracking his progress from a safe distance, and sending regular updates to the Queen so she could bring her main force to bear. These orders were scrupulously obeyed, and so the Earl was able to head toward Woodlands without hindrance. While the Earl of Westwood continued his headlong flight, his ally the Grand Duke Florian the Fair had succeeded in uniting his forces and turned to make a stand. The location he selected was Highdale, at the foot of Stonegate Pass. Highdale was a broad valley nestled high in the foothills of Farfell. The road ran along it, through a bleak landscape broken only by a couple of patches of stunted, wind-blown woodland and a solitary farm. Beyond the farm, the road turned somewhat to the right, and the valley started to narrow, ultimately becoming a gorge which climbed up to Stonegate Pass. Florian had chosen the battlefield with care. He placed his 2 regiments of grenadiers side by side, a few hundred yards from the entrance to the gorge, where the valley floor was narrow enough for them to form a line blocking its entire width. To the front of each regiment of grenadiers he placed a company of riflemen in open order. On the slopes to the right of the infantry he positioned the Grand Ducal Battery under Master Gunner Katzen, with a clear line of fire down the road, and, On the more open slopes to the left, he placed the cream of his army, his 3 squadrons of heavy cavalry, the Iron Knights, the Cornflowers, and the Wolfhounds. These he deployed in 3 columns, side by side, under his personal command. Along the road marched the long column of King Ludwig's army in their dust-stained white uniforms. At its head was the king's light foot, followed by the king's artillery, and then the 3 regiments of the royal foot guards. To the right of the column rode the king's heavy horse, with the king's light horse on the left. Seeing the blue-clad ranks of Florian's army deployed before him, Ludwig ordered the column to halt while he surveyed the scene through his telescope. He then issued a flurry of orders. He ordered the king's light foot to continue down the road, with orders to find a position of concealment from which they could distract and disrupt the gunners of the Grand Ducal battery with well-directed long-range rifle fire. He ordered his own artillery to move forward and deploy in a position where it could cannonade the enemy infantry. Finally, he ordered his 2 squadrons of cavalry to form a screen on the right flank of the army to counter any attack in that quarter by the heavy cavalry of the Grand Duke, which was advancing menacingly toward him. The king's heavy horse moved into position as instructed. The king's light horse did not, which left the king's heavy horse feeling somewhat exposed, severely outnumbered, and rather uncomfortable. And now the first shots of the battle were fired as the gunners of the Grand Ducal battery opened up, launching cannonballs in the direction of their advancing counterparts in the king's artillery. However, the range was extreme, and this opening salvo had little effect. Menaced by the rapid approach of the massed heavy cavalry of the far lands, the king's heavy horse nervously formed into line. King Ludwig ordered the 2nd Regiment of the Royal Foot Guards to move to its right and support the horsemen, and the repeated imprecations of the officers finally elicited a response from the troopers of the king's light horse, who galloped over the road and passed behind the line of heavy cavalry, who were at risk of being outflanked by the Iron Knights and the Cornflowers. In the normal course of events, the king's heavy horse would no doubt have felt some relief that their exposed flank was being protected by the light cavalry, but being outflanked was not their most pressing concern. The wolfhounds had formed into line and unsheathed their sabres, and were thundering toward the king's heavy horse at considerable pace, with aggressive intent. The 2 lines of horsemen came together. The contest was brief and brutal. The king's heavy horse were obliterated. With barely a pause, the wolfhounds charged on, now heading directly toward the 2nd Royal Foot Guards, who were still formed in a column of march. To the right of the onrushing wolfhounds, the king's artillery unlimbered, but it was apparent that the horsemen would be past them and into the infantry before the guns could be brought to bear. It seemed inevitable that the 2nd Royal Foot Guards would be swept aside. Anticipating such an outcome, behind the 2nd Royal Foot Guards, the 3rd Royal Foot Guards formed into a massed column, the better to repel the rampaging cavalry. But the 2nd Royal Foot Guards surprised them all. Somehow, even as the horsemen fell upon them, they too managed to mass their ranks and hold the wolfhounds at bay. And now the Royal Artillery opened fire, but not at the wolfhounds. Instead, cannonballs started bounding through the ranks of the Iron Knights. Disconcerted by this, the Iron Knights withdrew. The cornflowers had formed into line and were preparing to charge down the valley slope and into the king's light horse. But, observing the discomfort of the wolfhounds and the retreat of the Iron Knights, the cornflowers revised this plan and joined the retreat. And now the retreat of the Farlands cavalry became general, as the wolfhounds saw their support disappearing and also turned the heads of their horses toward their own lines, trotting back the way they had come, accelerating their pace somewhat when the king's artillery redirected its fire in their direction. Exuberant at having repelled the blue-clad cavalry, King Ludwig ordered the 1st and 3rd Royal Foot Guards to resume their march along the road. Some distance in front of them, the king's light foot had now passed the farm buildings and spread out into open order, cautiously advancing toward the Grand Ducal battery, which was still firing at the king's artillery and now starting to find the range. The Farlands riflemen had moved forward and began sniping at the king's light foot, who retaliated in kind. An ineffective exchange of fire between the opposing forces of light infantry ensued. Thus relieved from the attentions of the king's light foot, the Grand Ducal battery redoubled its barrage of the king's artillery. Bounding cannonballs decapitated gunners, smashed limbers to smithereens, and reduced gun carriages to matchsticks, and Ludwig watched in dismay as his artillery, his pride and joy, was comprehensively shot to pieces. Meanwhile, the march columns of the 1st and 3rd Royal Foot Guards had advanced as ordered, the 1st Royal Foot Guards following the road, while the 3rd Royal Foot Guards marched in a parallel column to their right. They had now reached a point level with the king's light foot, who were thus screening the 1st Foot Guard's left flank. Florian responded by once more putting his cavalry into motion. The king's light horse was still lurking indecisively to his front. Florian ordered the Iron Knights to advance along the valley side and prevent the light horse from moving up in support of King Ludwig's infantry. He also dealt with that infantry more directly, ordering the wolfhounds to wheel right and advance toward the flank of the 3rd Royal Foot Guards. For the moment, he held the cornflowers in reserve. The 2nd Royal Foot Guards had remained in the rear. King Ludwig now ordered them to advance in support of the 1st and 3rd Royal Foot Guards. The men formed into an attack column and marched forward to the beat of the drums as their flags fluttered above them. High on the valley side, heading in the opposite direction, the Iron Knights observed the 2nd Foot Guard's progress along the valley floor. But the blue-clad horsemen had other priorities. They trotted past the advancing infantry and then spurred their steeds to the gallop, sweeping across the slope, straight toward the king's light horse. The sight and sound of a squadron of heavy cavalry heading at you at full charge is intimidating. The king's light horse could have been excused had they chosen to make a run for it, but they stood their ground, and they put up a better fight against the Iron Knights than their colleagues, the king's heavy horse, had managed against the wolfhounds. There was a short but savage exchange of sword strokes, and then the two lines of horsemen separated, facing off each against the other. Meanwhile, back down in the valley, the 3rd Royal Foot Guards had formed square, which had the desired effect of deterring the cornflowers from charging into them. And now it was the turn of the cornflowers to feel apprehensive, as the massed ranks of the 2nd Royal Foot Guards bore down on their left flank. Alert to the danger, Florian the Fair threw in his reserves, ordering the cornflowers to advance toward the right flank of the 2nd Royal Foot Guards. The sight of the 3rd Royal Foot Guards forming into square was a source of much joy to Master Gunner Catsson, who ordered the gunners of the Grand Ducal Battery to direct their fire in that direction. Careering cannonballs crashed through the tight-packed ranks, wreaking havoc. At the same time, the Cornflowers rode headlong into the 2nd Royal Foot Guards, sabres swinging. The 2nd Royal Foot Guards, who had put up such a spirited resistance to the Wolfhounds, were unable to repeat that performance. The Cornflowers made short work of them. It is not altogether clear how much of this carnage was visible to the King's Light Horse from their position down the valley. It is undoubtedly the case that they chose this moment to turn about and briskly withdraw, taking no further part in that day's fighting. The 1st Royal Foot Guards had also seen enough and started heading back up the road the way that they had come. But the King's Light Foot showed more resolve, charging toward the Grand Ducal artillery on the slopes above them. This action was valiant, but foolhardy. Master Gunner Catsson ordered the guns to be loaded with canister, which was discharged into the light infantry at point-blank range. That pretty much put paid to the King's Light Foot. The few survivors were finished off by accurate fire from Florian's riflemen. Having dealt with the King's Light Foot, the Grand Ducal Battery reloaded with shot and resumed fire upon the 2nd Royal Foot Guards, tearing their square into bloody rags. The ordeal of the infantry was ended when the Cornflowers charged into their shattered ranks and remorselessly put the survivors to the sword. It was now clear to King Ludwig that he had suffered a catastrophic defeat. He hastily rode after the retreating column of the 1st Royal Foot Guards and followed them from the field. Thus ended the Battle of Highdale, the 2nd encounter of the War of the Noble Alliance.